All right, let's talk about the final component of Chapter 15, and that is the cattle crush. You may have been sensing that this was coming based on what we've been doing recently. So, if you're a large feedlot, you are definitely a big commercial firm, and you've got resources and expertise to engage in sophisticated hedging strategies, and these guys definitely do. So, the cattle business is, the cattle feeding business is buy light calves, feed them corn, sell heavy calves. And there are price risk associated with each of those three components of the business. And there are successful futures contracts on the CME exchange for each of those components. So there's two cattle contracts. There's the feeder cattle contract, and one feeder cattle contract is specified for 50,000 pounds of light calves. A light calf is going to be not those baby calves that are coming off of a cow-calf operation, but calves that are coming from a backgrounder operation. So the feedlots, the big feedlots, are buying about 750-pound animals from a backgrounder, and they're going to finish them out till they're about 1,000 to 1,500 pounds per animal. Okay, so if we take one feeder cattle contract, which is 50,000 pounds of light calves, and divide that by 750, one feeder cattle contract covers about 66 animals. And we said that the big feedlots are running more than 1,000 head per year through their feedlot, so you can see how many, you can start to get a feel for how many contracts they might need to hedge their feeder cattle business for a year or a month. There's also what's called the live cattle contract. Now these are the heavy calves that are ready for slaughter, and the size of that contract is about 40,000 pounds of fed cattle, and these fed cattle are going to be about 1,000 to 1,500 each, and that works out to the live cattle contract covering about 32 animals. That calculation is here in the textbook. So if you take these two cattle contracts and you pair it with the corn futures contract, because they're going to be feeding quite a bit of grain to these animals, then you can pretty much hedge their exposure to price volatility in this business. Okay, so let's talk about the two contracts and how they're settled. The feeder cattle contract is what's called financially settled, which means there's no delivery in this contract. There's no means by which you can stand for delivery and have these 750-pound calves delivered to you. The CME publishes this feeder cattle index, and it's based on cash sales reported to the USDA market news. So like that price report that we looked at in an earlier video. The live cattle contract, by contrast, is what's called physically settled, which simply means that they do make and take delivery into this contract. And if you're really interested in this market, you can go read the details in the CME rulebook about how they handle delivery in this market. Okay, so we talked about how many animals is covered. There's 66 animals covered in a feeder cattle contract, 32 animals covered in a live cattle contract. So if you roughly need twice as many live cattle contracts as you do feeder cattle contracts. So keep that in mind. Now let's try to work out how much corn contracts we need to hedge. So we're going to use this rule of thumb that 6 pounds of feed produces 1 pound of gain in beef cattle, and beef cattle feed is about 75% corn. That means it's going to take 198,000 pounds of feed, 148,000 pounds of which is corn, to grow 66 animals from 750 pounds to 1,250 pounds. Okay, so see if you can make that work out. It turns out that's about 2,651 bushels of corn. Since each futures contract of corn is 5,000 bushels, we need about 2 contracts of corn futures to hedge feeding 4 feeder cattle contracts worth of calves. So 2 feeder cattle contracts is about equivalent to 1 corn futures contract at 5,000 bushels. And so if we kind of center the ratio around how many feeders we're going to buy, if we buy 4 contracts worth of feeders, then we're going to need 2 contracts worth of corn to hedge the feed costs. And we know we need twice as many live cattle contracts as we do feeder cattle contracts, so we need 8 live cattle contracts. So typically the hedge in the cattle crush is going to be an 8-4-2 spread, where we do 8 contracts live cattle, 4 contracts feeder cattle, 2 contracts corn futures. This spread is going to be good for feeding about 266 animals that were purchased at 750 pounds, raised until they're 1,250 pounds, and fed about 10,600 bushels of corn. Now, the other part of this spread that we haven't had to consider that much is the timing. In the other spreads, we said, okay, we're going to buy soybeans, produce meal and oil, and sell that immediately. So our contracts that we were using were usually either all in the same month or as close together as we could get it. In this business, we know it's going to take 3 to 6 months for the finishing, for the cattle finishers to put the weight on these animals. And the weight at which they slaughter them will also kind of depend on feed costs and what the price of boxed beef is at the time. But you do know that there's going to be some significant time lag. That means that when you buy your feeder cattle contract, when you hedge your purchase of feeder cattle, it should be 3 to 6 months. The contract the contract maturity you choose should match when you're going to buy feeders in the cash market, and that should naturally be an expiration that's 3 to 6 months prior to the maturity of the live cattle contracts that you're hedging with. Because, for example, you're going to be buying feeders in November and then selling fattened cattle in November, December. I'm going to count up months here. December, January, February at the earliest, March, April, May at the latest. So if you hedge with a November feeder cattle contract, you're going to be hedging with a March, April, May live cattle contract, depending on when you want to sell those fattened cattle. And then remember that you're going to be feeding corn during that whole time. So if that's the hedge you're going to place where your feeders are purchased in November, then you're probably going to be hedging corn with the December and March corn contracts to kind of cover your corn purchasing exposure over that time period. So for example, you might, the timing that I do here in the text is kind of different than the one I just did orally, but the difference between the two contracts is still about 6 months, 3 months in this case. So for example, you might sell 8 June live cattle contracts, buy 4 January feeder cattle contracts, and buy 2 March corn contracts. Or maybe 1 March and 1 May, depending on how you want to do your hedge. So we're planning on buying feeder cattle in January, selling fat cattle in June, and buying corn the whole time. And that would hedge that exposure. But notice the timing, there's a lot more leeway in the timing than in the other hedges that we've talked about. And you can, as a cattle feeder, you can look at what the market is offering you in terms of feeding margin for feeding for 3 months versus 4 months versus 5 months versus 6 months and say, okay, I can lock in with these futures contracts, I can lock in my feeding margin, which one is the biggest margin for me. And that's usually how they're going to determine how long to feed the animals and when it's time to go to slaughter. Alright guys, that does it for chapter 15. I'll see you guys later.